Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm super excited about today's episode. Like, I've been a little nervous. I'm going to be honest with you.
Well, I'm pretty excited too. And I think it's really cool how quickly Todd agreed to do this, really without having to pull any strings or anything like that. And I also think that I hope people not only enjoy this episode, share this episode, but understand there's more to come, because as you're going to find out over the next 45 minutes or so, Todd has a lot of connections and a lot of people that have cool stories, but it's not just about, well, you've seen them in a lot of movies or, they're professional athletes, but they have a passion to make this world a better place. So, today we've got Todd Wagner on, who many may not or may know, but Todd Wagner has been business partners with Mark Cuban for many years. They went to college together. Started a little thing called broadcast.com that got sold to Yahoo. Yahoo. That's
for $4.6 billion.
For a few billion dollars.
It's 4.6. I did my research. You put a B. If you put a B in Illions, I'm going to do my research.
Yeah. So, and the cool thing is, and we'll talk a little bit about it. We really want to talk about, a bigger topic, but
for sure.
It was something that was just born out of passion of two guys that loved their sports teams and wanted to listen to it. Todd is, Mark Cuban is the more upfront guy who likes to be in the limelight and likes to be on camera, and he does a great job at it. But Todd's been involved with him in so many ventures moving forward. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it today, but Todd has been super successful in his ability to raise money for charities too, through charity auctions, basically, and give people the opportunity that, when you hear about so-and-so bought a dinner with Bono or, a famous wrestler, what they're doing is they're raising money for charities and using those connections for the good. We've talked about with so many of our guests that people are using their platform for the right thing. Yeah. And man, this guy is using his platform for the right thing.
Well, awesome. I'm excited. Let's get started.
All right.
Live from Times Square, it's Pop Recovery Systems, led by visionary Laura Alexis. Pop Recovery Systems, redefining surgical recovery with bariatric expert Dr. Eric Smith. Innovating surgical preparation and recovery, Pop Recovery Systems blends nutrition, mental health, and wellness.
Breaking through the noise and changing an industry. Join Laura Alexis and Dr. Eric Smith on the Pop Culture Podcast.
Well, Laura, I am super excited to have our guest today, Todd Wagner. I was fortunate enough to get to meet Todd. Gosh, I guess it's been a little over a year now, of all places, at a football game, which I know you're going to make fun of me, Laura, because I'm always at some sporting event, and really had a really cool conversation. And we'll get into this later because he asked me a question, and don't let me forget to tell you what it was as we start the discussion later on, that I have never forgot. And I've actually used that question to other people, to patients. And I've been doing this for over 18 and a half years and never had someone pose it to me that way. But in all honesty, the question he asked me is, he said, do you ever feel like your patients don't have a fighting chance, no matter how hard they're trying? And I was like, wow, I've never thought about it that way. So as we get into this discussion, I think we'll be able to maybe, obviously get his opinion on that and my opinion now that I've thought about it. But Todd, we're really excited to have you on here. You've been involved in so many things, and we've had guests in the past where we always talk about their platform leads to something bigger, from Olympic gold medalists to people who've designed exercise equipment. And it's always come back to their platform led them to something that they become passionate about. And I think that's where we'll go today. So thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, I can't miss out on this opportunity because as I was talking to Alan, who works with you and is a good friend of mine, and I was doing a little bit of research. Your passion to get into broadcast.com or to start broadcast.com really, if I'm not mistaken, came out of you and Mark Cuban really just wanting to hear and listen to Indiana basketball games. Is that not correct?
That's exactly right. And isn't that the way a lot of these companies start, right? There's a perceived problem. It may not be a big problem, and then it turns into something that you want to do next. And that's exactly right. There was no way in that era to be able to listen to something or watch something live unless it was on cable or on some far-reaching, radio station that had coverage around the country. And so that was the genesis of it. And so we really were the first to stream media in the world.
Right.
We took the early technologies, made it possible. Until then, you had to basically download a WAV file and be able to, after you spend a half hour, listen to something for a couple of minutes. It started with audio, eventually became video. And we were, when we sold to Yahoo, the largest broadcast network on the internet, which is what we called ourselves. And we're one of the, top 10 most visited sites in the world.
Well, we're going to have to put a description of what a WAV file is.
I'm old enough to remember those, Laura. You may not be, but I remember being in college and ready to kill my roommate if he picked up the phone while I was trying to download something from the internet at that time.
It's gotten so much easier, right? I mean, it used to be very complicated. You had to be able to be a DOS programmer, and you had to be able to have certain abilities to be able to do things. And now, somebody gets on a phone and all of a sudden they're a technology savant. It seems pretty easy to me with all the advances. Back in the day, you had to do an FTP of a file to be able to, watch something. And now we look at where it is now. So it's great. And yes, it's been amazing to think that 25 years later that streaming media has become almost the centerpiece of strategy for a lot of the major media companies in this country. So it's a really interesting moment. I think Mark feels the same way of just looking back at what, we kind of helped start.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's so fascinating too, because it came from a love of your passion for sports and your sports team. I have to tell you, growing up in Kentucky, just like you growing up in Indiana, basketball is like bred into you, right? Some of my fondest memories growing up is my parents could never really afford tickets to go to a Kentucky basketball game at home, but they would always, for Christmas, we would go to the game in Indianapolis when they used to have the Hoosier Dome, and they would split the dome, half Kentucky, half Indiana. That was kind of their gift to me and my sister. And we would go to the Indiana-Kentucky basketball game, which I know you've got some pull. We got to get that game back somehow, right?
Yeah.
But, so it rings true to me because growing up loving college sports and loving sports, but specifically Kentucky basketball, your guys' love for Indiana basketball was really just a basic need or necessity that turned into that. Has sports always played an important role in your life? Obviously, your involvement with professional sports and the Mavericks continued.
Yeah, I mean, sports was always important. And I just think it's a life lesson for everybody. I think what sports teaches all of us is just the ability to know we're part of a team, that we have to be able to work with other people. That it's not all about us.
Yeah.
And I think those are all great life lessons for all of us as we get older. And so, I was involved in sports my whole life and watching it obviously with Mark and the Mavericks. And as we get into the food fight conversation, just being around world-class athletes and then them having issues with their food consumption, which I know we're going to get to, just teaches you so much about how we're all interconnected. And so, sports is great. Sports is important. It has a culture that brings us together. I've been to the last 7 Olympic Games. I love them, right? Because it's fun to watch the best in the world at whatever it is they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, especially Olympic athletes, they don't get the credit they deserve. They're going through and working so incredibly hard, and there's no lucrative contract for most of them at the end of it.
Right.
And so I really enjoy watching whatever the sport is. I mean, you name it, we go watch it at the Olympics, because I just enjoy seeing the best at whatever it is they do.
I love that.
It's actually our first guest was a Olympic gold medalist, Nick, and it was like his story. I've always respected sports, but I have to tell you, I didn't grow up playing sports, so I learned the hard way that it wasn't all about me. I didn't learn that through sports, But it was like just his story that literally I was telling Eric the other day. I have been sticking to my commitments, sticking to my goals, because he practiced in COVID no matter what. And it's like, I started watching this show Sprint on Netflix about the Olympics runners and how, like, no matter what, they make it happen. And I think that it's so important that you bring up the fact that no matter how hard they work, if the quality of their food is poor, that even they were having issues and getting sick and finding, these weaknesses that they couldn't control, So I think it's really,
we'll get into these topics on food, but it's like, even, I view great athletes or great entertainers. I see the same things. I've been lucky, right? I've met probably nearly everyone that we could name as a famous person, but you see the same threads over and over again. Their work ethic, their passion, their drive. People want to believe they're just lucky. And I would argue most of them are the furthest thing from lucky.
Yeah.
Because of what they bring to whatever it is they do. One person I've become really good friends with over the years is Governor Schwarzenegger, and he just wrote Be Useful. I don't know if you saw the book, but it just speaks to the fact that there's so many of these people that they're just putting in the hard work every day. He doesn't need to be doing anything anymore. My goodness, he's been governor of California. He's had the career that we all know of, but he's out there now as an activist and, holding the summit in Austria every year to talk about climate change and all the things that he does. I just see this thread over and over with these folks, that they just have such tenacity. And as we get into this food topic, I think it's important to remember that everybody wants to do the right thing, but when the deck's stacked against you, as it is with food, and we're going to talk about it, it's very hard. And that's why our big mantra at FoodFight USA, foodfightusa.com, is it's not you, it's the food. And when you don't have the ability in this country to have a level playing field, it's almost impossible to be able to have a healthy diet in this country currently. And I know we're going to get to all that.
It goes back to that question I said that you asked me that night. And I thought about that so many times. And I think I knew how much of an issue that was, but I'd never had someone from the outside looking in ask that question. Taking care of patients who battle with obesity, it's so easy for the outside to make judgments about, it's just they're lazy or they just eat poorly. It's like they do these things intentionally to themselves. They look at it as a self-inflicted disease. And, almost every disease that we battle, there's some behaviors that we take part in that may exacerbate it, make it easier or harder to control. But most diseases are a disease, and obesity is no different. And, I remember when I attended the premiere in Washington with you guys for Food Inc. 2, and you had the panel of you had senators and congressmen and people up there talking about it. And that topic kept coming up. And I was so compelled afterwards to talk with a couple of them, as well as with Alan, because that comment of it's not you, it's the food. I've been having that conversation with patients every day, just in a different way of like, they come in feeling so defeated. Like my doctor just looks at me and says, well, you need to eat better. Why don't you just eat right and exercise and you won't be obese anymore? And they think they're trying. It's not because they don't listen to the recommendations, but the recommendations are so vague. And gosh, we could talk for hours about eat right. Well, what does that even mean in the United States? Yeah. And they feel so defeated. So by the time they come to us, I'm trying to get them to feel like you're not the exception, you're the rule, And so it's okay. It's not you. Let's find a treatment for you. And it was interesting to hear that from that perspective. But really, what was the big moment? And we talked about this a little bit, but the big moment for you to finally say, I want to do this to make a difference for everyone, because I know that there was a little bit of a personal experience that you had.
Mm-hmm. For years, and I still am, right? I've been a big time migraine sufferer, and I would have anywhere from 8 to 10 migraines a month. And I never could figure out why, and then when and I'm lucky, I would get the ability to go to Europe and I wouldn't have them, and they'd almost completely disappear. And I would think, wow, is it because I'm on vacation? Is it because you look for all these things, but every single time I went, it would be different. And then you'd start talking to people and anecdotally hearing them go, yeah, I was just in Italy and I ate pizza and pasta and I didn't gain weight and I don't know why. Why is it so different? And that started me in the process and the journey. So I had put a few dollars into a documentary called The C Word about 6-7 years ago. Morgan Freeman did the voiceover, and Lori McCreary, who's his producing partner, had produced it, and she's a good friend of mine. And so I reached out to Lori and I said, has anything happened since you guys made this documentary? Because it covered a few of these topics. And she said, no, we're film producers. Nothing's really happened. And I said, would you care if we did this together and let's join forces and see what we can do? So I started doing the research and found out that indeed there was a reason. So Europe has one food agency. It's called the EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency. And it regulates food from the farm to the table. And I'll explain why that's important in a minute. But its approach is completely different than the States. So think of it as like if we were in a courtroom. In Europe, you're guilty until proven innocent, meaning if you're going to put a new chemical into the food supply, it has to be approved. And it has to be approved by not scientists on the payroll of food. They have to be independent scientists who do the science and do the review of it. And they don't just do basic testing, they do what's called cumulative effects testing. Because why that's so incredibly important, and I say this to people as they're starting to learn about this topic, what cumulative effects means is it's like, because there's a lot of parallels to cigarette smoking in this, by the way. We could both have 10 cigarettes today. We are not going to get lung cancer. So if you just test a small amount of red dye 3 or potassium bromate or any of these chemicals and then say it's okay, it will be okay, because just like cigarettes, the effects happen over time. So cumulative effects testing is incredibly important to understand, because many of these chemicals are in a variety of foods that people consume for 10 and 20 and 30 years. And then all of these chronic diseases show up. So anyway, in Europe, there are only 410 approved chemicals. That's it. In the US, this is the game stopper. There's over 10,000 in our food supply. Now, this nightmare gets worse because in the US, it is the only nation in the world that has what's called GRAS. And GRAS stands for generally recognized as safe. So there was this loophole, well-intentioned, put in 1958, so that certain chemicals meant for things like baking soda and vinegar would not require rigorous FDA approval. In other words, it was safe, it was okay, and it didn't need that approval process. And that worked well for a period of time until, again, like a movie script, let's go to the good part, until food companies got bought by the tobacco industry. And that's where the bad actors come in. So after the tobacco industry settled, after 14 years, I might add, of legislation, they bought food companies, they bought Kraft, they bought Nabisco, and they took the same playbook and said, how do we make food more addictive? Now, they didn't use that word. They called it hyperpalatable, but it's the same thing. How do we make food more addictive? And then how do we make it last longer, right? How do we make it easier to ship? How do we make it easier to distribute? That began this arms race to create synthetic man-made chemicals that got put into our food supply. So it is now estimated, by the way, that since the year 2000, 99% of all the chemicals in our food supply, the new chemicals, have not been approved by a government agency, not approved by the FDA. To which most people would then say, how is that? That's not possible. Yes, it is. So they have used this loophole. They have exploited this GRAS loophole, hired their own scientists who are on their payroll. And as someone who has a background in the law, I guarantee you can hire an expert to say anything on both sides. Just go to any trial and you'll see an expert on both sides of an issue. So they hire these folks to come in and say, and by the way, it's the same group of experts over and over for these agencies to come in and say that red dye 3 or potassium bromate or on and on and on are fine. Therefore, it doesn't require FDA approval. And they just put it in the food supply. And by the way, if the FDA even pushes back, they are legally allowed to withdraw it and put it in anyway. So this nightmare gets even worse because I've spent a lot of time with the FDA over the last year. They don't even know if there's more than 10,000. So why is that? Because there are many chemicals that we don't even know the names of them because they withdrew it, put it in the food supply, and then put it under names like natural flavorings, et cetera. So this crime drama gets worse because it could be 15,000. Nobody knows. 10,000 is the number everybody bats around. But if you peel back the layers and talk to the FDA, you find that nobody really knows for sure the number. So anyway, so all of these are in our food supply. So the way we always explain it to people, I always say, if I only have 2 minutes with somebody, the most basic things I try to impart to them is that you have been the subject of a 50-year experiment in our country of what all of these man-made synthetic chemicals are doing to our body. They subvert our metabolism. They make it impossible for you to lose weight. They make it, as we know, and I know the subject of many of your podcasts, we have an obesity epidemic in this country. For sure, it's an epidemic. But what I tell people, it's not your fault. It's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back, because try to find something that's not what they call an ultra-processed food. So an ultra-processed food is now estimated to be maybe 75% of the average American's diet. Ultra-processed, it can be complicated, but it's really simple in the sense of it's stuff that's not in your kitchen. When you go to that label on the side and you can't pronounce half of it, because I know I can't, that means it's ultra-processed. That means it's been made in a lab somewhere. That means it hasn't been approved by a government agency. And that means you're putting it in your body. Yeah. So the parallel I always give to people is, imagine if new drugs in this country, if there was no FDA oversight. If the drug companies, Pfizer or Merck, pick your poison, could just say, we did the safety study, let alone the efficacy study, right? But we did the safety study and everything's great. And so we're going to go ahead and put it in the market. That's effectively what we're doing with food. These are chemicals. These are toxic. At least with the drug industry, I would argue, we're getting some benefit because in theory, you're treating a pre-existing condition. So we're trying to help someone. So we're giving them something that has side effects. But in the case of food, we all have to eat. And we are treating people that are basically healthy and then making them not healthy over a period of years.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You brought up the example of natural flavors. And Anna she did a ton of testing and she found out she's allergic to yeast. She has a really bad reaction to it, a variety of symptoms. You can buy a food and you don't see yeast in it. But there's natural flavors actually has a list of multiple ingredients. It's almost like it's its own food. And guess what? Yeast is one of them. So basically anything that says natural flavors, she has to try to avoid. So even if you have 20 ingredients, it's really not 20 ingredients. Sometimes depending on what one of those 20 are, there may be another subset of 10 or 15. You talked about the tobacco industry, and I think fortunately, a large in part because of the work that you all have done, there's been a large discussion where people now realize that the major food companies, the majority of them are owned by the tobacco industry. And, I think what's interesting is they not only bought these food companies, they took the same chemists that they had at these tobacco industry, from the way I understand it, and brought them over. And like you said, they used a different term, which means the same. But their job's to sell a product. You know, even when tobacco we knew was bad for us, their job was to sell it. That's how they paid the bills. That's how they grew their business. But it was something you could choose to take part in or not. And food, you can't. It is, in my opinion, the most dangerous thing that you could develop an addiction to, because you have to have food to survive. Now, the general public may clump all that together in one category and call that food. We know that there's good food and bad food. It's really not food. But I don't think people really understand the ramifications of intentionally developing an addiction to something that you have to sustain life.
Look, on the days I'm most upset, I liken them to, like drug pushers, right? They're selling you something, purposefully trying to make you addicted to it, and the health consequences be damned. There's a really great quote by, I think it's Wendell Baker, of, we are fed by a food industry that pays no attention to health, and we are healed by a health industry that pays no attention to food. And as long as those two ships keep passing in the night, we are not going to make progress, because both sides need to understand that one drives the other. The tobacco industry, they have sense. They no longer own these companies. So I do want to be fair. But the playbook that they put together in the 80s is what's still followed today and what they do. And a couple little tidbits for folks to just know. So we understand what we're dealing with. The cigarette industry in the 20s and 30s, they knew that cigarette smoking was harmful. They knew it. They had studies. Now, they came out later in the course of state legislation that was eventually filed. But warning labels were not put on cigarettes till 1965. So it took 40 years. The advertising ban wasn't until 1971. And the settlement was in 1998 of over $200 billion. But it took over 800 private claims, bringing fraud, violation of various state protection statutes. And that's the same beast we're up against. After I got involved in this, so the first thing I did was I talked to Governor Schwarzenegger, and I told him about this, and he said I will help you. So he helped me.
That was pretty good.
And thank you. And so what I did was I learned that California had a piece of legislation that was kind of stuck in committee, and I got to know Assemblyman Jesse Gabriel very well. And he said, look, we need this to be bipartisan, which, by the way, if any topic deserves to be bipartisan or nonpartisan, this is it.
Amen.
This should not have a single political agenda or ramification. This is about health. This is about nothing else. And the beauty, at least of what I've observed, not only because of our recent election, but just in general, is both sides of the aisle are actually saying about the same thing. That's almost never happens on any topic.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got involved. I met with Governor Newsom a little over a year ago, the first time, talked to him about this legislation, and he signed it into law in October last year. And that removed 4 what I call kind of the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, right? The really bad guys.
Yeah.
It's a few of them off the streets: red dye 3, potassium bromate, propylparaben. And that's all well and good, but you're not stopping crime. You are playing whack-a-mole and still falling behind, but it was a start. And I think that opened the door personally. I believe because then 10 states introduced similar legislation in their state that is now in various places of the process, including banning some of the food dyes. Then California went back last fall and also passed now the California School Food Safety Act and banned 6 dyes in school food in the state. That is, I'm seeing matriculate throughout all the states. And now I was just out there a couple of weeks ago, and they want to do more. Then we have, of course, what's happened, we hope, in the new administration, and more that can happen. And from my perspective, more is always better. This, as I say, has nothing to do with politics. So what we are fighting for at FoodFight USA is a few things. Legislation, because it unfortunately is a legislative fix. We've got to get the food supply cleaned up. We've got to get some of these chemicals out of the food supply. So we try to get that grass amendment that has to be closed. It has to be stopped because it just allows them to put even more chemicals into the food supply. So you got to get that closed. Then You got those 10,000 chemicals. I call them like the cows roaming in the fields because the barn door's been open. You've got to round them up. In other words, you've got to do some analysis of what those 10,000 chemicals are doing to people. So I spoke at the last FDA meeting about what's called post-market GRAS, which is those 10,000 chemicals and what to do. And I'm be quite honest, their resolution was not very satisfying. So I talked about it because they were going to look at one chemical at a time, and it might take a year, and it might do this. And it's like, that's not
one chemical per year. Isn't that 10,000 years?
Yeah, that's the math I did. So I spoke to them about using AI and about there are databases out there from the NIH, the EPA, who has a thing called ToxCast, and from the FDA and others, so that we could do an analysis more quickly. So how would we do it? Well, how about let's look at the 50 most used toxic chemicals in our food supply, like high fructose corn syrup, or we could all create that list of the ones that are in. So you'd start there, and then you would look for potential molecular overlap with the ones that are known carcinogens to see if you can flag any of these other ones to see. So we've already had these preliminary conversations, not to mention you could look to Europe where so many of these things are already banned. And so when the food companies get all upset with folks like us about, well, what you're doing is going to disrupt our business, and what are you going to do next? It's like, well, just go look at Europe, because anything that's a banned carcinogen, we're coming for that next, because that's the other thing I say to folks when I talk about it with them. The two most outrageous things is the side of the package wasn't reviewed by a government agency. We talked about that. And the second is that this is already being reformulated and done in Europe and Canada and around the world. So it's not like what we're asking for is being done nowhere. Like every country has 10,000 chemicals. No country has it except us, because there is no GRAS equivalent anywhere else in the world. So that's where you have to start.
So I have some questions about this. When we look at eliminating some of these things, which I'm 1000% for, I spend majority of my time in Costa Rica, actually. And so when I go to the US and I eat, I see a complete difference than when I'm in Costa Rica and I eat. And even the taste of things, I've been blessed to be able to go overseas, but before I experienced all that, and I was just from Virginia, my mom worked 3 jobs. And it's like some of these things that are not good for you are also the fastest, the most affordable. And so what my thought goes to is when all of these things are eliminated, is it going to affect the cost? How are we going to avoid it affecting the cost? And the other thing I think about is, in places like Europe or even Latin America, you can go to a bakery and get a loaf of bread for so cheap, and it's fresh and all of that. You look at that same loaf of bread in the United States and it's like triple, quadruple the cost, so that's
and it's not bread.
And it's not bread. And it's not bread. So that's the question that I have. And I think that many people will have. This sounds like it's necessary. It should have never gotten this far. In fixing it, how is it going to be paid for? So
I'm from Gary, Indiana. That's where I grew up. And whenever anybody says Michael Jackson's from there, I say, yeah, he left at 6. I grew up. So I understand issues maybe a little differently than some from where I came. And the point is that you are absolutely right. That is certainly the perception. But we need to now update people on the reality, meaning Happy Meals are $15. McDonald's has had to lower the price of Happy Meals. In fact, their CEO has publicly stated they are going after low-income communities to try to get them in McDonald's to eat the food and artificially lowering the prices. So to say that it's cheaper, I do not believe it's true. Now, is it more convenient? Absolutely. That one I can't argue with you, right? I can walk in and get food and be done in 30 seconds. Is it more expensive? That I don't think so. That I believe we can compete with now. But let me put another kind of thought in your head. Part of why we're in this jam, and this gets a little more complicated, but I think it's important, is the way we motivate farmers in this country. And that's the part of the country I come from, right? So I hope I understand it a little bit. Farmers are incentivized to grow certain crops, corn, soy, wheat, because they're subsidized, because the government helps to pay for them. They get what's called crop insurance and other things so that they have a safety net. So that's about 60% of the products. But what's important for people to understand is you're not eating those, meaning 99% of the corn that's grown in this country, 1% is the corn on the cob or something that you're having. The rest is what's turned into high fructose corn syrup, all these other sugars, and all of these really bad for you chemicals that end up being eaten by the animals, that then we end up eating the animals, and we get inflammatory and what's called omega-6 versus the clean omega-3s. And so it is this cycle that we have to break. Only 1% to 2% of our farmland grows fruits and vegetables. Why? Because they're not incentivized to do so. And if you're a farmer in Iowa or Indiana or Kentucky or any of these places that we are from, they got to feed their family. And so the model, and you'll see on our mission statement that one of our 3 pillars is to work with farmers, but we have to do it in a way that's economically viable for them. It can't be, you can't guilt people into anything, but we have to clean up the farming system because, we talked a little bit about all these chemicals. Well, there's also chemicals that start in the beginning by the farm. So we call those the sides, pesticides, insecticides, fungicides that are sprayed into these products before they even leave. So by the time you get your fruits and vegetables, you can't wash that off. That's already become a part of the crop. So we have to move from conventional farming eventually, and I would argue relatively soon, into, they call it regenerative farming, but farming that is sustainable for people, animals, and the environment. And it can be done because it's also being done in Europe. I've visited those farms. I've walked those places. So in order to solve what you are pointing out, you have to start at in the very beginning, I said EFSA, and it was great because it regulated from farm to the table.
Yeah.
That's what we needed here, because we have to have one agency in theory that regulates the farm, the packaging, and what gets to the table. Right now, that's broken into the USDA, the EPA, the FDA. There's overlaps. They don't often communicate with each other. And we have a very disjointed system of how to do it, because you have to, in my opinion, fix this in its totality, which makes it sound complicated. And it is, but it's not. The very first movie we ever did was a documentary called Enron. If you remember Enron, the bad guys in Houston. And when we made it, people said, you can't tell that story. It's too complicated, because it was accounting gimmickry and all these things that they had done. And Ken Lay was still alive. And when we made it, they threatened to sue us. And Mark and I were like, great, that'll just be more publicity for the movie. But what we learned, and what I learned, was it wasn't complicated. It was just greed. And that's what this story is.
Yeah.
This is not complicated. It's very complicated to solve. I don't mean to minimize that, but the issue is greed.
Yeah.
It's corporate greed. It's greed in how to save a minutia of a cent on food to put in more synthetic chemicals so they don't have to use real ingredients. They don't have to use milk. They don't have to use cheese. They don't have to use all of the things that used to be in our food supply. So if incentivized properly from the farm all the way to the end, the cost can be more affordable. And let me give you one other way I think about this that may be for folks to consider. Like a can of Coke, say it's $1. Let's just pick an amount. And you say, well, it costs $1. Okay, but it doesn't cost $1. Because what ends up happening as people eat these kinds of foods over time, now on the back end, there's the healthcare costs. And there's all the other issues that come from it. So that Coke really costs the country $5. I'm making it up, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What happens is that Coca-Cola is privatizing, making profit from it. We as a country are bearing the cost on a social level, because now that person having all of that, now when we get to the Medicare and Medicaid and all those other things, now we as a country bear the cost, because 20%, by the way, of their revenues for Coke comes from SNAP, which, updated food stamp program, right? Supplemental nutrition. assistance program. It comes from SNAP. So they don't want to change it.
Which many people don't even know that families are allowed to choose that.
Yeah.
And are flabbergasted to find that that's something that they can get through SNAP.
And then one other thing I would say to that, because I care dearly about this topic too, what about everybody else? So the other thing, FoodFight, we are trying to do, and we're going to work on it this year, probably with EWG, Environmental Working Group, is a seal. So here's the way to think about this one, hopefully. There's about 200,000 pantry items in grocery stores around the country. So the middle part of the grocery store, not the produce and all the goodies on the side. Of those, about 27% are not ultra-processed foods. And of those 200,000, about 11% are what you would define as nutritious. So let's think glass half full. That means about 20,000 items for sale right now are not that bad. They're healthier choices, but people don't know which ones they are.
Right.
Nobody does. I've been with people, I don't care how educated, not educated, here, from there, it doesn't matter. They're like, should I eat that? Because the ingredients, portion sizing, the ingredients, you need a PhD to even understand it. So we want to create an app or something on the packaging so that if you're shopping at Dollar General or you're shopping at Walmart, which is where most of America is shopping, that they can make a healthier choice if they so choose. Because and those products exist today, right? We don't even have to, then back to your original question, it's not about, it's more expensive, it's cheaper. No, we just need people to know which one is healthier. Right. And that we can fix now. We just have to get it out there so people understand. So that's something I will push very hard for, so that the people that want to make healthier choices, and we all know we can't save everybody. Some people aren't going to care, and that's fine. But if we can have end caps or aisles with this, and the reason I think it's possible is EWG, Environmental Working Group, has something they put on cosmetics and toiletries and other items to designate that it's a healthier choice. And that is done pretty well. So the idea is the same kind of thing, that good housekeeping seal of approval kind of thing, to let people know there's a healthier choice for them out there. And I think that's super important because, to your point, we cannot leave people behind. But step one would be healthier choices that exist today that they don't even know are there. And then you get into all the education of try to eat real food, all of that stuff that everybody shoves at everyone. But there's healthier choices right now.
Well, I like that you said that, because real quick, my thought, I'm thinking like devil's advocate a little bit, which usually you do that, Eric, but I'm doing it now. Is like, there's problems with the foods. So now they're going to create these new foods and they're going to have these new prices. And now there's this whole new bucket of money, so knowing, no, these foods exist right now. We're just going to show you which ones they are. I think that is a fantastic way to start, to show like it's been there. You just have to know how to find it.
And there's not one singular company that's going to benefit from it. Like I don't know how much time you've got, but this could really stir up a storm. But it's something that's really drives me crazy. I am in the midst of the hotbed of GLP-1s. The Ozempics, the Mounjaros, the tirzepatides, the semaglutide. We can use the generics or the brands. We could go on and on. I'm a bariatric surgeon, but I'm an obesity specialist. And so, just like any specialist, we have to have different ways to treat a disease. I have never and will never be, because I have surgeon after my name. Well, medications are bad. But let's have a really good conversation. There's been a recent, discussion by the current administration that they want to get Medicare, Medicaid to cover these medications. And it's really easy for us all to set off streamers and fireworks and high five and say, oh my gosh, we're finally going to take care of greater than 50% of the population within a few years, basically, and that are on government programs that otherwise these medicines are $1,200. And I'm not even going to get into the ridiculous cost of these medications. But about 6 months ago, Nestle came out and said that they were going to develop specialized foods for people on these medications. Now, you probably know more about this than I do, Todd, but I'm pretty sure that people on the committee for these medications are also have special interest in these food companies. Mm-hmm. They're feeding themselves, no pun intended, the way I look at it. Well, if I make this medication available to everybody, but I precipitate the problem with foods that aren't truly healthy, then man, this is never ending. The total cost of care for these medications to keep the disease chronic is astronomical. I just did an interview with Newsweek, and we'll see what comes out of it, because when all you can do is say what you believe and then you see how it's written. But here's my thing with this. I'm all for treating obesity for everyone, no matter what economic status they are. But you said it earlier about the two ships passing. If we don't fix the food problem, or God forbid, if we add to it, we're making a problem worse to do nothing but sell more drugs. What's your thoughts on that?
Look, we are, as you know, this is such a complicated topic. And again, I'm someone who's not a doctor. So people can take what I say with whatever grain of salt they want to. But I've witnessed all of these different brands of medications through the years that were designed to solve a problem, and they end up many times making it worse. I personally think that if someone has 50, 60, 70 pounds or more to lose, that they should consider it, because they are in a real health quandary.
Right.
And I feel like their circumstance is more dire. If someone has less than that to lose, I think it's a mistake to use it. I believe that there are other methods to get themselves where they need to be. And that just like any prescription drug, this is my opinion, it should be used for the people that really need it. And that includes, I have my own opinions, not the topic of this show today, high blood pressure meds and how they're given out to people at certain levels that I would argue might not need it, but it helps sell more of them, or even statins, or on and on down the line. I'm a big believer in the bell curve of, if somebody really needs a med, by goodness, that's what they're there for.
Right.
But to give them out to people when it's a 1% effective increase in their, likelihood to die, and then they've got side effects for the next 20 years, I'm not as big a fan of it. So I believe that those kind of meds in the long run are not a good thing for most people. And you know this a lot better than I do. People are going to have to make sure they're not losing muscle mass and that they're training.
Correct.
Metabolism, and then paying that price down the road. And it's super complicated. Like everything, there is no quick fix for an issue like that. But what I do know, 75% of our country is now overweight or obese. 75%. That's an epidemic by any, and over 40% is obese. And so my point is, yes, we can sit on this high horse and say, oh, we need to fix all these things. But if you are morbidly obese, I want you to live.
All right.
So to me, you pull out all the weapons to try to help that person to survive. But I think for somebody who's got 20 to 30 or 40 pounds to lose, I think they should look at it a bit differently in how they want to solve the problem. For them, I don't believe that medication is necessarily the right choice. Everybody can make their personal choice. I mean, who cares about my opinion? But that's the way I think about those things. And what I would say, though, is like there are, not on that topic, but related to it. So there are now apps. So back to when we were talking about the chemicals and the processed chemicals. There are apps like Yuka and GoCoco that people can go and scan those foods and find out if it's a healthier choice. So back to our conversation about Dollar General and Walmart, to be able to go in and be empowered as a consumer to make a healthier choice, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
I am not anybody's governor of how they live their life. The farthest thing from it. I just want them to make an informed choice. That's also why we're fighting for front of package warning labels like cigarettes. People still smoke.
Yeah.
Right.
40% of the country used to smoke. Now I think it's 11 or 14%, but 10% plus of the country still smoke. Okay. They've been informed. They've been told on the front of the package what it might do to them over the years. Same thing with food. They've used these warning labels successfully in countries around the world. So in South America, they have what they call black octagons. And they are on foods if it's high in sodium, high in sugar, or high in saturated fat. And if you get one of those black octagons, you can't advertise to kids anymore. So if it goes on your cereal, which, by the way, it's going to go on any Kellogg's or other brand cereal, you don't get to advertise to kids anymore, because to me, effectively, you're selling them a cigarette.
Right.
You're selling them something that's really bad for them. Now, if a parent chooses to purchase it, that's fine. But how about we inform them?
Right.
So that's why we are fighting for front of package. And we've made some progress with the last administration with Secretary Becerra to try and have front of package put on foods. There's conversations of it with the new administration. I hope it happens. But let me give you guys a little story to understand how the food companies are. So they did it in Mexico. And you had to put the octagon on the front of the package if it was high in any of those three things. So what the food company did was made the front and the back identical, then told the retailer to flip it to the back. And that way the warning labels wouldn't be on it for the shopper. So this is what we're dealing with, right? These are not people looking out for you. They are looking out, again, always follow the money. That's why I told the Amazon story. It's just greed. And nothing more than that. I always say, though, you can't exercise your way out of this. If you eat, you remember that documentary years ago that Morgan Spurlock did, Super Size Me?
Yes.
Where he ate McDonald's every day. And I always say to any of these corporate CEOs, if these foods are so great, why don't you eat them every day? Why don't you, if they're all fine and there's no problem with them, or in moderation, as you put it, then have them.
Yeah.
By the way, in Europe and Italy, it's only 20% of the diet. In America, it's 70, maybe 80% in certain food deserts of the American diet. You have no chance. Back to what you were saying earlier. You have no chance if you are in a food desert to eat properly, which is why we think, again, we need to identify those goods that are healthier choices.
Right. And public service announcement from me for our listeners who, may have taken 30 seconds of what I said. Again, I think these medications have a role. I think if we see evidence, and we do see evidence, although it's short term right now, we have singular years data right now, but we are seeing in the right patients prescribed the right way with the right support system in place from a mental health standpoint support, nutritional standpoint support, not handing these out like Adderall prescriptions, but doing it the right way, they can be very effective. But we already see an alarming problem that if people aren't paying attention, won't realize that when somebody like Nestle gets involved and we're like, oh my gosh, these drugs are so good, we're going to make customized foods for it. And on the outside, it sounds great, but we know that same company specializes in ultra-processed foods that aren't food, and many of these foods that create not a nutritional response to help them preserve muscle mass. It's going to make a number on a scale maybe go down, but they're not even healthier. And I think that's what we have to be really, really careful with. And to go back, we can't fix one without the other. You said that so perfectly at the beginning, and it's so, so true. If we're really committed to impacting obesity, and it has nothing to do with partnering with pharma, then let's impact obesity, and let's impact all components of obesity, all around the way. The other thing that I would say that I run into my patients dealing with is they are committing to maybe getting rid of some of the obvious things that are so unhealthy. The fast food. Maybe they say, I've got rid of fast food. So many times patients will say, I got rid of, in Kentucky, it's sugar pop. I got rid of sugar pop, right? Mm-hmm. But now I watch them and they're putting, and I don't want to pick on people and I'll use generic terms, but they're putting syrups in drinks and they're putting flavorings in drinks and they're adding all these things that has no calories in it, but there's 25 ingredients. Like, how do you in a lab design something like that? But it's so unfair because they've eliminated all the sugar in their diet. They are decreasing their caloric intake, but I'm not going to lie. I have concern for the long-term well-being because it's not just an occasional when I feel like I need a treat, it's becoming part of their routine diet.
And again, I would argue this comes back to the addictive nature
Yes.
of some of these products and the things they get on. And so I have, as I know you all have, empathy for these people. This is not a weakness in character. This is something that people are trying. Again, that's why I call them drug dealers sometimes, these food companies. They are trying to get you addicted. They want you to not try to eat one Oreo. None of us can do that, right? Try to eat 5 Cheetos. You're not going to do it because the ingredients are soft. They're easy to digest. And I tell people, everybody calls these ultra processed foods. I call them addictive edible substances. It's not food, right? If I took Cheetos, there's not a single food ingredient. It's this synthetic chemical. Let's put each of those in a petri dish and say, this is what you're eating.
Yeah.
Now, it's masqueraded to look good or taste good or whatever. There's not a single nutrient, not a single food in there of what you're ingesting. We know what food looks like. And so what happens is they are on purpose. And not everybody in the population, just like in anything, is going to become addicted to this. But there is a substantial portion, they estimated at 15%, that is going to be addicted. And they have complete disregard for what that's going to be. And all the research, all the data, all the stuff we go by shows that it's just as addictive as cocaine or any of the other things that are out there. And it has all the same things where people the next day are mad at themselves. Oh, I shouldn't have eaten that whole tub of ice cream. Darn it, I'm not going to do that again. And then they do it again the next night. Those are all addictive tendencies. And we've all been there and we all understand it. And what makes me upset is they are getting away with it, just freewheeling. But I'm hopeful. I am hopeful that there has never been more momentum than there is right now. People who have been in this space a lot longer than I have, 20 years, like Dr. Mark Hyman or Sanjay Gupta, who are all friends of mine, or Dr. Oz, they're all friends. They have never seen so much momentum as right now, which gives me hope. But as someone who has hopefully made a career of sensing momentum and being disruptive and doing it, we got to move. Yeah. We got to get it done. Strike while the iron is hot. I've read that 1/3 of the American people have now at least heard of the name ultra processed foods. That's enormous, right? Yeah. That's huge. Yeah. We have to keep going now to get it to a place where we are, because you see it like I do. I mean, meds have their place. Of course they do. For anything acute or break your leg, you're going to an emergency room. But these meds, the quick way out is not the ultimate right answer for most people, because for all the reasons you cited and all the reasons we've talked about. But I think that's true kind of medicine in general. They're given out too easily. They're given out for people that I would argue don't need them. But remember, we're dealing with big pharma, and we're also dealing with big ag, and we're dealing with big food in this whole totality of the topic. And they are very powerful and they have a lot of influence. And, should there be advertising on our television shows, right? Should there be all of those things are topics that are going to have to be talked about, because that impacts consumer behavior. When they come on, they're all smiley singing songs and then minimize the side effects, or they're whispered at the end of the commercial. And those are real. I think they have their place. Again, if somebody needs it, I am all for it. Again, in the patient that you described, right? If somebody is, morbidly obese, my goodness, we do whatever we need to do. Yeah. I'm 100% for it. But we need to be careful of giving things out for people that maybe there are alternatives.
And they have to have the resources in place to have the longevity of that success or those results. If I took the total pounds that I've operated on in 2 days, on Monday and Tuesday this week, it would be in the thousands and probably mid thousands. I can tell you the highest weight I operated on this week was just under 600 pounds. These people need help. And it's an intervention from surgery that gives them the best chance statistically to get out of that category. And I always say, if I can get you out of that morbid obesity category, I can take your risk of dying 10 to 20 years too early and take it back to baseline. You may get hit by a car, but I can do my part. But that's part of the process. We have to teach you how to eat right, but we have to get to the point where we give them the tools to be successful long term. And, and that's part of our education and teaching and trying to get them to understand that, yes, we can do something like surgery and we can give you a start and a tool that will be in place for the rest of your life. But supporting that tool the right way with the right resources and the right food is what's going to give you the best chance to stay healthy. And if I could, Eric, add one other thing to that is we've exported obesity to the world. So our fast food companies have exported, be they the McDonald's, the KFCs, et cetera. So now the obesity rates, it's not just the United States anymore. It's, 800% growth in obesity rates in China, doubling in most of these other countries that didn't even have obesity issues 30 years ago. But now they will go over to Brazil. They will go over to these other countries with all of the same ultra processed foods that Americans have. And they will all of a sudden make it available to them. And then they don't want their traditional food anymore because, again, they get addicted to, it tastes good, right? So they like another one and another one. And now we have created an obesity epidemic around the world and arguably maybe even worse there because they don't have the healthcare system to support it. Right.
So if it spirals in Brazil, it's a huge problem here, but it's an even bigger problem in those places. So that's the thing. The one thing we've exported is these awful diets and these awful foods to the rest of the world that didn't have an issue until we came along and put it out there.
Yeah. Well, I think, you said it eloquently earlier, but it is so true. This is a bipartisan issue. And anybody who wants to try to make it anything but that is really just kidding themselves. This has nothing to do with what side of the political party you are on or what side of the fence you're on. This is a health issue. This is an issue. This is a humanity issue, to be honest with you. And it shouldn't matter whose voice it comes from. I'm at least excited that it's got the potential to take the forefront that it has. And I hope we all can put our differences aside politically and just say, it doesn't matter whose quote idea it was. Let's just get this done. That's the main thing.
And if I can have one parting shot on all of this too, just so people understand, right? If we could just kind of head a little closer to Europe's rates. So right now we have almost a $5 trillion healthcare budget in this country. And about 35 million Americans are diabetic, about 11% of the country. So that's about a $500 billion spend right now that we spend just on that, let alone all the other chronic diseases that come from, these ultra processed foods. If you look at Europe, they have 1/3 the obesity rates. They have 1/3 the diabetes rates, et cetera. So you could save $400 million on our federal budget just by getting the foods to people that would allow us to have a more normalized, situation in this country and these other places. And even our military now, we only have 22%, I think it is, of young people that can even apply for the military due to obesity issues and the ability to pass basic training. And now they are lowering the standards of basic training just to get people through. And in fact, I was told a week or two ago by a general that they are now releasing more people due to health and obesity issues than any other within the military itself. So it just impacts everything, right? It's our national debt, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's our military, it's everything that we as a country, I know some people are more proponents of certain things or not, but no matter where you come, it impacts us, not to mention all the way down to the individual who feels like they can't control what they're eating. And that's why, yes, it's how we started, hopefully how we end. We say it's not you, it's the food. Yeah. Because you just have no chance in a system. Try to go to a restaurant and find healthy things. Try to find a menu. You go through them and you can find maybe one or two things. It's just impossible. Go to some of the, the big ones, the cheesecake factories, everything's 1,600 calories, 2,000 calories for an entree.
It's heartbreaking to look at people on a daily basis and they have shame in their eyes because they say, I have an addiction to food. And they think, how did I become addicted to something that I can't say completely no to if I want to live? And they do not realize, they think it's all on them. They think, shame on me for being addicted to food. And to be honest with you, I think as a society, sometimes we have more empathy for people who've become addicted to a substance like, heroin or, cocaine, because everybody knows that if it's introduced to you, you can't help it. It was designed to do that. We got to open our eyes and realize that these people who have an addiction to food isn't that they're addicted to food. They're addicted to the crap that they're putting in our food. And it's getting categorized all across the board.
And it's awful that they should feel any of that, judgment from people any more than we do for any of the other addictions in life. And I hope what you all do and what we're trying to do will at least shed the light so that people understand that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that this conversation was definitely a start. And I'm sure there are so many people who are listening here want to know where they can start to do their own personal research for themselves. So FoodFight USA.com is a great place to start, right? What are some other resources offhand that we could plug that people could just become more familiarized with this subject?
I would tell them start there. I would tell them to also download the Yuka app, YUKA, so that they are more empowered with the foods they buy. There's another one, like I said, Go Coco, but Yuka's got a big foothold. They were started in France. 1 out of 3 people in France downloaded it. They got manufacturers to change ingredients because people weren't buying the really bad food. So I would tell anybody watching this, Yuka, YUKA, they do amazing things, and you feel more empowered with your choices, with your food and with cosmetics.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for taking time to spend time with us today and sharing. I mean, I learned a lot. And I'm really excited about what you're going to be doing with FoodFight USA, both of you. And, if you have any questions about this particular subject, you can reach out to foodfightusa.com directly. They also have an Instagram, and I'm sure they're very active there. But get educated, get in the middle of the conversation. It's going to affect us all. So why not start talking about it now? And we'll see you next time on the Pop Culture Podcast.